They cut down my trees for a better view. What they didn't see was me taking everything from them in court. It started with the roar of chainsaws tearing through the stillness of a Saturday morning. The sound was so unnatural, so violent, that at first I thought I was dreaming. But then it came again, sharp, relentless, mechanical snarls that rattled the glass of my bedroom windows. I stumbled out of bed, half awake, tugged on my robe, and slipped into my old house slippers. The smell hit me before I even reached the door, a pungent mix of gasoline and fresh-cut wood. When I stepped onto the porch, the sight froze me where I stood. A hired crew of men in orange safety vests and hard hats had invaded my yard. Chainsaws buzzed in their hands, their blades already biting deep into the thick trunks of my century-old oaks. These were trees that had stood for generations, their branches stretching wide like protective arms, shading my property through blazing summers and whispering in the fall winds. They weren't just trees, they were history, memory, and belonging. And now they were collapsing in a matter of minutes. "Hey, what are you doing?" My voice cracked as I ran barefoot across the damp grass. One of the workers barely glanced at me before shouting over the noise. "The HOA authorized this. The board said your trees blocked the lake view." The words struck like a hammer blow. My chest tightened, my stomach knotted. The HOA, those smug neighbors with their endless rules and their obsession with community aesthetics. They hadn't called me, hadn't warned me, hadn't given me even a chance to object. Instead, they had sent in strangers with roaring machines to butcher what I thought was mine. Branches cracked and fell with sickening thuds, sending up clouds of dust and leaves. I reached out instinctively, as though I could hold the trunks upright with my bare hands, but I was powerless against the saws. With every slice, I felt something inside me tearing loose. I wasn't just watching wood fall. I was watching years of family barbecues, long afternoons reading in the shade, and quiet evenings with fireflies vanish into a heap of splinters. The foreman barked orders, indifferent to my protests. My voice was drowned beneath the engines, swallowed whole by the chaos. Neighbors peeked from their windows, some even stepping out onto porches, but no one spoke up. Some looked curious, others almost satisfied. My heart sank further, realizing that this wasn't just an accident or oversight. It was deliberate. As the third oak tilted, groaned, and toppled into the dirt, I felt something burn in my throat. Not just grief, but rage. They thought they could take from me without consequence, that their authority made my home and my memories disposable. In that moment, watching decades of growth turn into stumps, I made a silent promise. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. The chainsaws finally fell silent, leaving behind an eerie stillness broken only by the crackle of broken branches and the occasional thud of another limb being dragged to the roadside. My yard, once alive with towering green canopies, now looked like a battlefield. Raw stumps jutting up like broken bones, the air thick with the smell of sap and gasoline. And there she was, Karen. The HOA president stood on the sidewalk as if she had orchestrated a parade in her honor. Her arms were crossed tightly against her tailored blazer, lips pursed in smug satisfaction. Behind her, a couple of board members lingered, whispering to each other, their expressions caught somewhere between guilt and glee. I stormed toward her, fists clenched at my sides. The words ripped out of me before I could stop them. "These are my trees. You had no right." Karen didn't flinch. Instead, her smirk deepened, as though my outrage only confirmed her victory. "Community guidelines," she said smoothly, like a teacher reciting a rule to a disobedient child. "Preserving lake views takes priority over private landscaping. The board voted. You'll thank us later when property values rise." Her tone was ice over steel, calm but laced with condescension. She spoke as though the decision was final, unchallengeable, ordained by some higher power of community order. I took a step closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "You've stolen from me. Those trees were here before half these houses were built. They were part of this land, part of my family's history. You had no right to touch them." Karen tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing in mock pity. "Oh, please, Don't be dramatic. They were just trees. And if you really cared, you would have attended the last board meeting. We posted the agenda. Rage surged through me. I hadn't been notified of any meeting, at least not in any way that mattered. Buried in some obscure HOA email chain, perhaps sent at the last minute. Classic Karen tactics: manipulate, maneuver, and strike when no one was watching. I glanced back at my yard, my stomach twisting. It looked like a massacre. Piles of branches, shredded bark, and deep ruts carved into the earth by heavy machinery. The shade that once cooled my mornings was gone, replaced with harsh sunlight that seemed to expose every scar left behind. I turned back to her. "You'll regret this," I said, my voice shaking not with fear, but with the weight of a promise. For the first time, her smirk faltered. Just a flicker, but I saw it. The recognition that I wasn't going to roll over like the others. That I wasn't going to let this pass quietly. But in true Karen fashion, she recovered quickly, tossing her head back with a laugh that dripped with arrogance. "Oh, sweetheart, the only thing you'll regret is not trimming those trees sooner." With that, she pivoted on her heels, clipboard in hand, and walked away as if she had signed the final line of a contract. The board members followed, whispering behind her, leaving me standing in the ruins of my yard, fists trembling, heart pounding. As the dust settled and the crew loaded their equipment, one thought rooted itself deeper than my grief. Karen thought she'd won. But she had no idea what battle she had just started. The silence after destruction is always the worst part. When the last chainsaw sputtered to a stop and the work trucks rumbled away, I stood barefoot in the wreckage of my own yard. 100 years of growth lay scattered in jagged piles. Limbs snapped, leaves shredded, bark stripped raw. The ground was torn by tire tracks. The soil compacted where the machinery had crushed it. My lawn looked like a battlefield after a retreat, where the enemy had stolen everything of value and left only scars. That night, when I tried to sleep, the absence was louder than the chainsaws had been. My bedroom window, once framed in shade, now gaped open to the moonlight. It poured in too harsh, too cold. I pulled the curtains shut, but still, the emptiness outside pressed in. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak of the house, every sound from the lake that used to be muffled by leaves. It was as if my walls had become paper thin. My sanctuary had been stripped away. By morning, the change was brutal. The sun rose unfiltered, a blinding glare that poured through the bare yard straight into my windows. By noon, the siding of the house felt hot to the touch, and inside, the air stifled quickly. I cranked the air conditioning higher than ever, and by the end of the first month, the bill came back doubled. The house that had once stayed cool naturally was now an oven, roasting under direct sunlight like a bare slab of stone. My garden, my pride, my therapy, fared even worse. The hydrangeas wilted within days, their delicate petals burning to crisp brown. The ferns that had thrived in the shade curled up and died. The small patch of grass where I'd once sat in the evenings, sipping a beer and listening to the cicadas, shriveled into yellow straw. The oaks had been more than trees. They had been guardians, shaping an entire ecosystem. Without them, everything seemed to wither in mourning. And then came the noise. From dawn until late night, the sounds of the lake roared into my home. Motorboats revved, their engines echoing across the now unobstructed water. Music blared from passing pontoons, voices carried across the waves. Laughter, shouts, drunken arguments. All of it now funneled directly into my yard as though the lake itself had leaned closer to taunt me. Where once there had been a cocoon of leaves muting the world, there was now nothing but raw exposure. I wasn't just losing sleep, I was losing myself. For weeks, I wandered through my house like a stranger, pausing at windows where trees had once framed the view. Now, instead of dappled green light, I saw open sky and glaring sun. Instead of squirrels darting along branches, I saw neighbors sipping coffee on their decks, smiling as they looked over their restored view. They were thrilled, of course. I heard them talking when I forced myself to mow what was left of the lawn. Can you believe how much brighter it feels now? Finally, you can see the whole lake from the road. Property values will jump for sure. Every word was a dagger. They spoke about my loss as if it were their gain, celebrating the destruction as though it were progress. None of them asked me how I felt. None of them offered condolences. They didn't even acknowledge that the decision had gutted my home's privacy, my comfort, my investment. To them, I wasn't a neighbor anymore. I was collateral damage. Karen, of course, basked in the praise. I caught glimpses of her walking the neighborhood with her little clipboard, head high, smiling proudly when residents thanked her for taking action. If she saw me, she didn't waver. She would nod politely, lips curling just slightly, as though daring me to speak out, daring me to challenge her in front of her admirers. But I stayed silent, at least at first. The financial toll hit harder with each passing month. My electric bills kept climbing. The loss of shade meant my siding began to warp slightly under the relentless sun. My once cool attic became an oven, forcing me to run fans constantly. Even my roof shingles started to curl at the edges, something my insurance company pointed out when I called about coverage. They asked about the tree removal, and when I explained, the adjuster just sighed. If it was authorized by the HOA, there's not much we can do. It's considered a community improvement. Community improvement. That phrase was a knife twist. Improvement for who? For Karen, whose deck now had an unobstructed view. For the couple across the street, who had complained for years about feeling boxed in. For the investors who would brag about the open lakefront when selling their houses at double the price. It was an improvement. It was theft of shade, of privacy, of value. I began to notice the smaller ways the absence haunted me. Without the oaks, the sound of rain on my roof was deafening. Storms lashed the windows harder. Wind howled with nothing to break it. My dog, once content to lounge in the cool grass, now paced restlessly, panting in the heat. Birds that used to nest in the branches stopped coming altogether. The backyard felt abandoned, stripped of its soul. At night, when the neighborhood quieted, I would step outside and look at the stumps. They stood like gravestones, pale rings exposed to the sky, each one a record of decades lost. I ran my hands over the rough edges, tracing the years cut away in a single morning. I thought of my father, who had swung beneath those trees in a hammock when I was a boy. I thought of the afternoons I'd spent reading under their branches, the summer parties, the fireflies. All of it gone, shredded into mulch. And always the rage grew. Neighbors avoided my gaze now, sensing the storm brewing inside me. They whispered, but they never confronted me. Karen carried herself like a queen certain of her dominion, but I noticed the way her eyes darted when I lingered too long on her. Sidewalk. She knew I hadn't accepted defeat. She knew I was biding my time, because I couldn't move on. Not yet. Not when every bill reminded me of the cost. Not when every dead plant reminded me of what was stolen. Not when every laugh from the lake was a reminder of the privacy I had lost. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything. The increase in expenses, the decline in my property's value, the emotional toll. Photos of the stumps, the warped siding, the garden reduced to dust. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was building a record, a case. Karen thought she had buried me under those stumps. She thought I would fade, just another disgruntled homeowner swallowed by bureaucracy. But she had underestimated me. What she had taken wasn't just wood and shade. It was trust, peace, and dignity. And I was going to take something back. For weeks after the destruction, I lived in a fog. Bills piled up, my garden shriveled, and neighbors treated me like a ghost haunting my own street. Each night, I stared at the raw stumps in my yard and felt the same helpless rage boil in my chest. I had shouted at Karen. I had sent emails to the HOA. I had even stood at their next meeting, shaking with anger as they smirked and shuffled papers. But nothing changed. The board insisted their actions were authorized. Karen repeated that smug line about community views. It was Marcus who changed everything. I didn't know him well at first, only through whispers in town. He was a property attorney with a reputation for two things: never losing and making enemies regret crossing his clients. Some called him ruthless. Others called him brilliant. I didn't care what label stuck, as long as he could help me. I remember the day I decided to call him. The electric bill had come again, higher than ever, and the insurance company had formally declined my claim, citing community-approved modifications. I stood in my kitchen with the paper trembling in my hands and realized this wasn't going away. They had stolen something irreplaceable, and unless I fought back, they'd get away with it. Marcus's office was on the second floor of a brick building downtown. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and old leather. When I walked in, his secretary barely looked up before saying, "You must be the homeowner with the tree case. He's expecting you." That startled me. Was my misery already gossip? The door opened, and Marcus stepped out. He wasn't what I expected. No flashy suit, no arrogant swagger. He wore a dark gray jacket, loosened at the collar, and glasses perched low on his nose. His hair was streaked with gray, his face lined but sharp, like a man who had seen too much nonsense in his career and had no patience left for it. "Come in," he said simply, his voice low and steady. Inside, his office was lined with books, heavy volumes of property law, stacked case files, binders labeled with HOA names. On the wall hung framed articles about landmark cases he'd won. I noticed one headline: "Homeowner defeats HOA in landmark ruling." My chest tightened with something I hadn't felt in weeks. Possibility. I sat across from his desk as he pulled a yellow legal pad toward him. "Tell me everything," he said. And I did. I poured out the whole story. The chainsaws at dawn, Karen's smirk, the neighbors cheering their new view, the bills, the warped siding, the dead garden. My voice cracked more than once, but Marcus just listened, pen scratching occasionally as he jotted notes. He didn't interrupt. He didn't roll his eyes. When I finished, he leaned back, folded his hands, and asked one question. "Do you have a bylaws?" I slid a thick binder across the desk. The dreaded HOA handbook, the one most neighbors ignored until it bit them. I had kept mine out of bitter habit, flipping through it in sleepless nights. Now it lay between us like a loaded weapon. Marcus adjusted his glasses and began to read. The room filled with the sound of pages turning, his pen tapping occasionally. My stomach knotted as I watched him. What if he found nothing? What if Karen had covered every angle, written every loophole to her advantage? Minutes stretched into an hour. I tried to sit still, but my leg bounced uncontrollably. Finally, Marcus stopped, flipped back several pages, and tapped the paper with his pen. "They overstepped," he said, his voice calm but decisive. I blinked. "What?" He turned the binder toward me and tapped again. "Right here. Section 4, Article 3. The HOA has jurisdiction over common areas and easements. But your trees? Fully on your lot. No easement rights. They had no authority. None." My pulse quickened. So what does that mean?" Marcus leaned back, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. "It means what they did wasn't just wrong. It was destruction of private property, legally actionable. You have a case." The words landed like a thunderclap. For the first time since that awful morning, hope flickered. Real, tangible hope. "But wait," I said, my voice catching. "They kept saying it was for the community. For the view. Doesn't that matter?" Marcus shook his head slowly. HOAs love to dress their overreach in the language of community benefit. But law is law. They cannot trespass and alter your private property without consent or legal right. This isn't just about the trees. It's about your rights as a property owner. And frankly, he leaned forward now, his voice dropping lower. Judges don't like bullies in suits, especially when they trample individual rights. I felt something stir inside me, something stronger than grief. Rage had carried me this far, but now it mixed with something sharper, resolve. Marcus wasn't done. He flipped more pages, highlighting clauses, scribbling notes. "We'll build this on multiple fronts. Property destruction, loss of value, increased costs directly linked to their actions. You got rising AC bills? Document them. Garden damage? Photograph it. Warp siding? Get a contractor's estimate. Every shred matters. We don't just argue, they pay." I swallowed hard. How much of a case do I have? Marcus didn't hesitate. "Strong. Very strong. HOAs like this rely on intimidation and silence. They expect you to grumble, maybe complain, but never fight back. You're different. And when we push, when we file discovery, you'll be amazed what comes crawling out of their closets. The image of Karen, smug and smirking, flashed in my mind. I imagined her expression cracking as she was dragged into court, forced to answer questions under oath. The thought alone lit a fire in my chest. Still, doubt whispered, but won't the board have their own lawyers? Won't they drag this out? Marcus chuckled softly. Of course they will. But let me tell you something. HOA boards hate exposure. They thrive on closed doors, on scaring homeowners into silence. Court is the last place they want to be, because court means records, public records. And once the community sees how they operate, their little empire crumbles. I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. For weeks, I had felt like a man standing alone against a fortress. Now, for the first time, I saw a crack in its walls. Marcus leaned back, steepling his fingers. The question is, are you ready to fight? This won't be easy. It'll take time, patience, and yes, money. They'll call you difficult, maybe even smear you. But if you're in, I'll take this case. And I don't take cases to lose. I thought of the stumps. I thought of Karen's laugh. I thought of the silence of my house at night, broken by the roar of boats where birds once sang. My answer came without hesitation. I'm ready. For the first time since the chainsaws, the heaviness in my chest lifted. It wasn't gone, but it shifted into something else. Not despair, not helplessness, but fire. Marcus nodded once, as though he had expected nothing less. Good. Then let's make them regret ever touching your land. Marcus's first instruction to me was simple, but it carried the weight of a commandment. Document everything. Every loss, every bill, every voice that can support you. The more precise the evidence, the more impossible it becomes for them to hide behind vague community guidelines. Courts don't care about feelings. They care about proof. So I became a collector, not of stamps or coins, but of pain measured in facts and photographs. I began with the stumps. Early one morning, while dew still clung to the grass, I walked the yard with my phone and a borrowed DSLR camera. I crouched beside each jagged trunk, capturing the rings exposed to the sky. Each photo felt like an obituary, a record of years cut short. I took wide shots of the empty skyline, showing how barren the property looked without its canopy. I zoomed in on the warped siding, the brittle garden soil, the shriveled hydrangeas that had once bloomed proudly beneath the tree's shelter. When I finished, I stood in the yard, staring at the folder of images on my screen. They weren't just pictures. They were exhibits, evidence of what had been stolen. Next came the experts. Marcus arranged for an arborist, Dr. Ellison, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and a gentle way of running his fingers over leaves, to walk the property. He studied the stumps, muttering under his breath, jotting notes on a clipboard. At one point, he knelt and traced the rings with the reverence of a priest at an altar. These weren't just trees, he said, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. They were giants, over a century old. Looks like this. They don't just grow back in a lifetime. When his report arrived a week later, I nearly dropped it. Valuation of loss, $327,500. The number stared back at me like a headline from another world. My trees had been worth more than most houses. Marcus raised an eyebrow when I handed him the report. This, he said, tapping the page, is what makes judges sit up straight. To them, numbers speak louder than outrage. And these numbers scream. But photos and reports weren't enough. We needed voices, witnesses. That was harder. My neighbors had been quick to celebrate the new view, but slow to acknowledge my loss. When I knocked on doors, some refused to answer. Others shifted uncomfortably, offering excuses about not wanting to get involved. Fear of Karen's wrath silenced many, yet not all. Mrs. Alvarez, who lived 2 doors down, opened her door with watery eyes. I saw them, she whispered. The men with the chainsaws. I told Karen it wasn't right. She just said, progress always comes with sacrifice. Her statement, notarized later, became part of the record. A retired veteran named Hank, whose porch faced my yard, agreed to testify. I watched the whole damn thing, he told me, his gravelly voice sharp with disgust. Didn't even give you a chance to object. That's not community, it's tyranny. Each statement added weight, another stone on the scale tipping against the HOA. Marcus compiled them meticulously, arranging them into neat folders that grew thicker by the week. Meanwhile, I began tracking the costs. I photographed my soaring electric bills, highlighted the totals, stapled receipts for repairs. I had a contractor document the warping siding, another estimate the cost of replacing the ruined garden soil. Every page went into the growing case file. My grief became paperwork, my anger ink, and staples. But with every step forward, Karen's shadow loomed. The first time she learned of Marcus's involvement, she cornered me outside my house. She wore her usual blazer, her hair pulled back into a severe bun, a clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. "So," she said, lips curling, "you've got a lawyer now." Goo. I kept my voice level. "This isn't cute, Karen. It's justice." She laughed, a brittle sound that carried across the cul-de-sac. "Justice? Please. You think one homeowner can beat the HOA? We're protected. We have rules, bylaws, attorneys on retainer. You'll bleed yourself dry trying, and in the end, you'll lose." Her confidence was a poison, but it didn't infect me this time. Because behind me, the stumps still stood like silent witnesses, and in my briefcase, Marcus's growing arsenal of evidence weighed heavier than her smugness. The notice came 2 weeks later. Marcus drafted it with surgical precision, a formal demand letter addressed to the HOA board, citing specific bylaw violations, attaching arborist valuations, and demanding compensation exceeding $400,000 for damages, costs, and emotional distress. I stood beside Marcus in his office as he reviewed the final draft. Once they receive this, he said they'll do one of two things: panic and settle, or double down and drag it out. Either way, we win, because we've cornered them with facts. The letter was served on a Tuesday morning. By that afternoon, the neighborhood buzzed. Board members huddled in Karen's driveway. Cars came and went. I spotted Karen herself pacing the sidewalk, phone pressed to her ear, her expression sharp and tight. The next day, she found me. "They laughed," she said. I frowned. "What?" "The board. We read your little notice, and we laughed. You'll never beat us in court. We've done this before, and homeowners always fold. Always." She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. "You think your pictures and bills mean anything? We have lawyers who eat this kind of nonsense for breakfast." Her arrogance was a wall she thought I couldn't scale. But as she turned on her heel and strode away, I realized something important. People who laugh that loudly are often covering their fear. Later, when I told Marcus what she'd said, he didn't even blink. "Good," he replied. "Arrogance is fatal in court. It blinds them, makes them sloppy, and we'll be waiting." For the first time, I smiled. Karen thought this was still her game. She had no idea she was already losing. The trial felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a battle for dignity. From the moment I walked into the courtroom, the weight of the HOA machine pressed down on me. Polished lawyers in tailored suits, Karen in her finest outfit, her hair styled immaculately, a smirk plastered across her face as though the verdict had already been written in her favor. She strutted down the aisle like it was a runway, pausing to give me a look of mock pity before settling at the defense table. When the judge entered, the room stilled. I sat at my table with Marcus at my side, a mountain of files and evidence spread before us. My palms were damp, my heart racing, but Marcus radiated calm, his composure like an anchor in the storm. Karen's attorney began with smooth arrogance, painting me as unreasonable, selfish, and unwilling to compromise for the greater good of the community. Karen herself nodded along, adding dramatic sighs and self-righteous expressions, as though she were a martyr for lake views. Sometimes, her attorney said, voice dripping with false solemnity, individual sacrifice is necessary so the community as a whole can thrive. My client, as HOA president, acted within her authority to ensure fairness and protect property values. Then Karen took the stand. She leaned forward, voice full of syrupy confidence. "Those trees," she said, "were blocking nearly half the lake view for several households. We had received numerous complaints. I didn't want to act, but as president, I had a duty. Sometimes leadership means making hard decisions. She looked at the jury as though expecting applause. Marcus rose calmly, buttoning his suit jacket. He spoke in sharp, deliberate strokes. Leadership, Ms. Hayes, does not mean breaking the law. Let me remind you, in this court, those trees stood entirely on my client's property. There is no recorded easement. There is no clause in the bylaws granting you authority over private landscaping. A ripple passed through the courtroom. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Then came the turning point. Our arborist, a silver-haired expert with decades of credentials, testified with the precision of a surgeon. He explained not only the monetary value of the century-old oaks, over $300,000, but also the ecological devastation, lost shade, soil destabilization, increased energy costs, the microhabitat destroyed. To restore what was lost here, he concluded gravely, would cost millions. And even then, it would take generations before the replacement trees reached maturity. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. One juror's eyes widened. Another shook her head in disbelief. Karen's smug mask cracked for the first time. She whispered furiously to her lawyer, her hands tightening on the table. Marcus didn't let up. He presented before and after photographs of my yard, bills showing skyrocketing energy costs, and testimony from neighbors who, under oath, admitted they never filed formal complaints about the trees at all, just casual remarks that Karen had twisted into justification. Piece by piece, the facade crumbled. What Karen had framed as a sacrifice for the community good began to look more like what it truly was, a personal crusade fueled by arrogance and abuse of power. When Marcus delivered his closing statement, his voice carried steady authority. This case is not about lake views. It is about rights. It is about one person deciding her vision of the community outweighed the rights of a private homeowner. That is not leadership. That is destruction. And it is illegal. For the first time since the chainsaws had roared that morning, I felt the tide turning. The courtroom was no longer Karen's stage. It was the place where truth and justice were finally catching up to her. The courtroom had fallen into an almost supernatural stillness. The murmurs that had carried through the trial, the shuffle of papers, the occasional cough, Karen's whispered asides to her attorney, were gone. Everyone's eyes were on the bench, where the judge shuffled through the last pages of the case file. His gavel rested to the side, his glasses perched low on his nose. I could hear my own breathing, loud in my ears. My heart beat so hard it felt like it was trying to break through my ribs. Marcus leaned forward, hands clasped, the picture of calm. But I caught the tightening of his jaw, the way his thumb pressed against his knuckle. Even he was holding his breath. Karen sat with her chin raised, pretending confidence, though her knuckles were white as she clutched her pen. Her attorney's face was unreadable, a mask honed by years of courtroom battles, but the sheen of sweat on his forehead betrayed him. The judge's voice finally cut through the silence, measured, deliberate, like the toll of a heavy bell. After reviewing the evidence, testimony, and the applicable statutes, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The word struck me like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of the table, hardly able to process what I was hearing. The judge continued. The homeowner association is ordered to pay damages to the plaintiff in the amount of $1 million for $100,000. Gasps exploded across the courtroom. A woman in the gallery clutched her pearls. One of the jurors glanced at another, their eyes wide with shock. Even the court clerk raised his eyebrows before quickly resuming his neutral expression. I nearly collapsed under the weight of it. My knees went weak, and I had to lock them just to stay upright. Relief washed over me like a wave so strong it almost drowned me. The months of anger, the sleepless nights, the grief of watching my trees fall, it all crashed against this single moment. Karen's jaw dropped open. For once, the smirk she had worn like armor throughout the trial was gone. She stared at the judge as though he had spoken in another language. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Finally, a strangled, incredulous laugh broke free. "This is outrageous," she spat, her voice carrying more desperation than authority. "We acted in the community's best interest. This can't stand." The judge raised a hand, his tone sharp, brooking no argument. Mrs. Hayes, sit down. The ruling stands. You are reminded that the HOA acted outside the scope of its authority, destroyed property without due process, and caused measurable, lasting damages. This court will not tolerate such abuse of power. Karen sank back in her chair, her face pale, her fingers trembling. Her attorney leaned in, whispering frantically, but she didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed forward, unfocused, like someone who had just seen the ground fall away beneath her feet. Marcus placed a steady hand on my arm. We did it, he murmured, though even his voice was hushed, reverent, as though acknowledging the gravity of the moment. But the judgment was more than numbers on paper. It was vindication. It was justice delivered not just for me, but for every homeowner Karen had bullied, every rule she had twisted to feed her own ego. The bailiff called for order as the room buzzed with whispers. Neighbors who had sat in the gallery, some out of curiosity, some out of loyalty to Karen, were now glancing at each other with unease. I caught snippets of conversation. Did you hear the amount? They're finished. She's ruined. Karen finally stood, her movements stiff, mechanical. She turned to face me, her eyes flashing with something between fury and disbelief. You think you've won, she hissed, her voice low enough that only I and Marcus could hear. But this isn't over. You've made enemies. I didn't rise to the bait. For the first time in months, I felt no need to defend myself, no need to respond. The court had spoken louder than I ever could. As Karen stormed out, shoulders rigid, the board members followed in silence, their faces masks of panic and fear. The ones who had stood behind her so proudly, who had whispered about community values and restored views, now looked like rats scrambling from a sinking ship. I sat there a moment longer, my body finally releasing the tension it had carried since that first roar of chainsaws at dawn. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from release. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what came next. Replanting, rebuilding, reclaiming not just my yard, but my peace. When we left the courthouse, the sun was setting. It washed the building in orange light. And for a moment, I thought of the trees, how their leaves once filtered the sun into soft gold on my porch. They were gone, but their loss had not been in vain. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the judge's words over and over in my mind. $1 million for $100,000. It wasn't just money, it was a reckoning. Years of arrogance had caught up with Karen and her board in one single ruling, a gavel strike that echoed far beyond those four courtroom walls. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. When the judgment came due, reality hit the HOA like a wrecking ball. They had no liquid funds, no secret reserve, no deep pockets. Their legal expenses had already drained what little they had collected from dues. The $1.4 million wasn't just a number, it was a death sentence. I expected them to negotiate, to stall, maybe even to appeal. But the ruling was ironclad, and Marcus moved swiftly to enforce it. Within weeks, notices went out. The HOA's assets would be liquidated to satisfy the judgment. For the first time, Karen and her loyalists faced the consequences of their arrogance, not in theory, but in hard numbers and property lines. That's when I learned the irony of ironies. Among the assets was a strip of communal land along the lake, prime shoreline property, the jewel Karen had bragged about preserving for community views. It was the ground she had stood on, arms crossed, the morning my oaks were cut down. She had weaponized it as a symbol of power. And now, by order of the court, it was mine. I remember the day the transfer papers were signed. Marcus handed me the deed with a quiet smile. It's official, he said. You're the legal owner of that land. I stared at the document, my name printed where once the HOA's authority reigned. A strange mix of triumph and disbelief washed over me. I hadn't just won damages. I had inherited the very heart of what Karen claimed to protect. When the news broke, the neighborhood erupted in whispers. Some neighbors avoided my gaze. Embarrassed, they had once applauded the restored view. Others congratulated me in hushed tones, thrilled to see Karen's empire crumble. As for Karen, she was livid. I heard through the grapevine that she had stormed into an emergency board meeting, shouting that the land belonged to the community, not some bitter homeowner. But the law didn't bend for tantrums. The paperwork was clear. I owned it. I walked that strip of shoreline for the first time one crisp morning. The lake glittered in the sunlight, boats drifting lazily across the water. I stood on the same ground Karen once used to lord her power over me, and I felt the irony settle deep into my bones. What she had tried to take from me, she had delivered into my hands. The board had wanted views. Now every view of the lake was mine to command. The air was thick with autumn's chill, the kind that crept into the bones and made the cul-de-sac feel quieter than usual. Leaves skittered across the pavement, caught in a restless breeze, as Emily stood on her porch, staring at the row of neatly trimmed lawns that lined Willow Creek Lane. The neighborhood had always felt like a postcard, perfectly manicured, predictably serene. But perfection, Emily had learned, was a fragile illusion, and the cracks were starting to show. It had been weeks since the HOA meeting that changed everything. Karen, with her sharp smile and sharper tongue, had ruled the Willow Creek Homeowners Association like a queen on a chessboard, moving pieces with calculated precision. She'd rallied the neighbors with promises of order and prestige. New landscaping, stricter bylaws, a neighborhood watch that felt more like surveillance. Emily had been one of the few to push back, her voice trembling at first, then steady, as she questioned Karen's decisions. The budget discrepancies, the fines that seemed to target certain families, the whispers of misused funds funneled into Karen's pet projects, a gazebo nobody asked for, a security system nobody needed. At first, the neighbors had glared at Emily. They'd clapped when Karen spoke, their eyes bright with the fervor of loyalty. Karen was their champion, the one who'd promised to keep property values soaring and undesirables at bay. Emily, with her quiet demeanor and dog-eared notebook of evidence, was the troublemaker, the dissenter who dared to question the queen. "You're tearing us apart," Mrs. Henderson had hissed after one meeting, her voice dripping with disdain. Others nodded, their faces tight with judgment. Emily had gone home that night, her hands shaking as she poured herself a glass of wine, wondering if she'd misread the truth. But truth, like water, had a way of seeping through the cracks. It started with a leaked email forwarded by an anonymous whistleblower, a junior HOA board member, some suspected. The email detailed Karen's discretionary spending, thousands of dollars siphoned from the community fund for personal landscaping, a new deck for her own backyard, even a weekend retreat build as an HOA leadership conference. Then came the audit, grudgingly approved after Emily's relentless petitions. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did the receipts. Karen's empire began to crumble, and the neighbors, once her loyal court, started to whisper. Now, as Emily stood on her porch, she saw Mr. Patel from across the street walking toward her, his hands stuffed in his coat pockets. His face was drawn, not with the usual neighborly nod, but with something heavier, regret perhaps. He stopped at the edge of her driveway, hesitating, then stepped closer. "Emily," he said, his voice low, as if the wind might carry his words to the wrong ears. "I owe you an apology." She blinked, caught off guard. Mr. Patel had been one of Karen's loudest supporters, always quick to praise her vision at meetings. "What for?" she asked, though she suspected the answer. He shifted his weight, glancing back at his house as if checking for spies. "You were right to fight," he said. "About Karen. About the money. I should have stood with you. I didn't see it then. I thought she was keeping things together, but..." He shook his head. "We were wrong." Emily's throat tightened. She wanted to feel vindicated, to let the warmth of his words wash away the months of isolation. But the hurt lingered, sharp as the autumn air. "You weren't the only one," she said softly. "Nobody listened." Mr. Patel nodded, his eyes fixed on the ground. "I know, but we're listening now. A few of us met last night. Me, the Garcias, even Mrs. Henderson. We're filing a formal complaint against Karen. She's stepping down, or we'll push for a vote to remove her." Emily's heart stuttered. She'd dreamed of this moment, but it felt heavier than she'd expected. "What changed?" she asked. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "The truth, I guess. Once the audit came out, people started talking. Really talking. Karen's been calling it a misunderstanding, but nobody's buying it anymore. And then, well, I remembered how you stood up at that first meeting, all alone, and I felt like a coward." Emily didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long being the outcast, the one who knocked on doors only to have them shut in her face. Now, here was Mr. Patel, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his own guilt, offering her something she hadn't dared hope for: allies. "You're not a coward," she said finally. "You're here now." He looked up, a faint smile breaking through. "Yeah, and we're not the only ones. The Garcias want to talk to you. They're hosting a meeting tomorrow night, off the record. No Karen, just neighbors." As Mr. Patel walked back to his house, Emily stayed on the porch, the wind tugging at her scarf. The neighborhood looked the same: tidy lawns, glowing porch lights, but something had shifted. The glares were softening, replaced by hesitant nods, quiet apologies. The truth was spreading, and with it, a chance to rebuild what Karen had broken. Inside, Emily's notebook lay open on the kitchen table, pages filled with her meticulous notes. She'd fought alone for so long, but maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to anymore. The morning sun spilled over Willow Creek Lane, painting the lake in the distance with flecks of gold. Emily stood at the edge of her property, her boots sinking slightly into the freshly turned soil. The land, her land, once seized by Karen's manipulative HOA bylaws, stretched before her like a reclaimed promise. She gripped the handle of a shovel, its weight grounding her as she surveyed the row of saplings she'd planted the day before. Young maples and oaks, their leaves vibrant with the promise of growth, stood tall along the boundary line. They were more than trees. They were her declaration, her green wall of protection against the greed that had nearly stolen this place from her. Months ago, Karen had orchestrated the seizure, claiming the strip of land adjacent to Emily's property for a community beautification project. The real motive, whispered among the neighbors, was to clear the way for a shared lake view that would boost property values, especially for Karen's allies. Emily's modest backyard, with its wildflowers and unmanicured charm, had been deemed an eyesore, an obstacle to their vision of suburban perfection. The HOA's vote had been swift, the paperwork ruthless. Emily's protests were drowned out by Karen's polished speeches and the neighbors' eager applause. But Karen's empire had crumbled. The audit, sparked by Emily's dogged persistence, exposed the misused funds, the fabricated justifications, the personal gains cloaked as community benefits. Karen's resignation had been a spectacle, her face flushed with humiliation as she stormed out of the final meeting, her gavel left behind on the table. The neighbors, once her loyal chorus, sat in stunned silence. Some, like Mr. Patel and the Garcias, had already come to Emily's side, their apologies quiet but sincere. Others still avoided her gaze, their guilt a private burden. Now, as Emily drove her shovel into the earth to plant another sapling, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The lake shimmered in the distance, its beauty untamed, but it was no longer the prize Karen's allies had coveted. The trees, taller and stronger than the flimsy shrubs Karen had proposed, framed the water in a way that felt right, like a painting Emily had composed herself. Each root she buried was a stake in her victory, a reminder that this land was hers, earned through months of solitary battles. She paused, wiping sweat from her brow, and glanced toward her porch. Her old wicker chair sat there, a silent witness to the nights she'd spent poring over HOA documents, her notebook filled with evidence of Karen's overreach. Today, she'd sit there with a cup of coffee, maybe even a glass of wine, and smile. Not a smug smile, but one of relief, of knowing she'd fought for what was right and won. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson lingered on her lawn, pretending to water her roses. Emily caught her glance, a flicker of envy or regret in her eyes. Mrs. Henderson had been one of the loudest voices cheering for Karen's plan, dreaming of an unobstructed lake view from her own window. Now, That view was obscured by Emily's trees, a living barrier that spoke louder than any speech at an HOA meeting. Emily didn't wave or nod. She didn't need to. The trees said enough. Mr. Patel approached, his hands in his pockets, as they often were when he felt uneasy. "They're beautiful," he said, nodding at the saplings. "The trees, I mean. They suit the place." "Thanks," Emily replied, leaning on her shovel. "They're not just for me. They're for everyone who thought this land could be taken without a fight." He chuckled, a little sheepishly. "Lesson learned. You've got more backbone than all of us combined." Emily shrugged, but her heart warmed at the words. It's not about backbone. It's about what's right. As Mr. Patel walked away, Emily planted the last sapling, patting the soil around its base. The lake glimmered, its beauty now framed by her defiance. Karen and her allies had wanted a view, a shallow prize to flaunt. What they got instead was a lesson: never destroy what isn't yours. And Emily, standing among her trees, knew she'd made sure they'd never forget it.